Just starting class. All right, well, welcome to Issues in Environmental Science. It's the 20th of October, and we're going to talk this week about human population growth. And this is based on material in Chapter 8 in the Hasenzahl textbook. So before we do that, I will ask if there are any questions over the exam or any issues or concerns about where we're at. No questions.
I have a question, Dr. McDonald.
Yes.
This is Darren.
Hi.
Originally, I thought you had said there would not be questions involving Chapter 7 on the midterm. However, there were. I mean, I was prepared for it, but I was wondering if you had changed your mind at the last minute. And a lot of the material and some of those true-false questions, I couldn't find anywhere, even after the fact, going back and looking for it. So I was kind of curious as to where some of that information came from.
Well, almost all of the true false questions. I mean, I added some questions that were made up from material that I presented in my lectures. It may have been different or would have been different from what was in the textbook. But all of the other questions in the textbook in the exam, most of them had already been assigned during the reading quiz, and so the reading material should have covered the true false questions. I'd have to look at a specific one that you were concerned about to say where the answer would be found.
Okay, and then any time frame on when the essays might be graded?
Yeah, I'll have them done by the end of this week.
Okay, thank you, sir.
No problem.
I had a few that were repeated questions. Was that on purpose?
Oh no, that was an error.
Okay, yeah, I had like probably before I got done with the true and false or the multiple choice, I probably ran into like 4 that were just previously in that same test. There was like 4 questions that I answered again.
Huh. Shouldn't have been, I mean, I guess that could have happened. But I thought that. Okay, well, if it did, I'm sorry. You knew the answer. Hopefully you answered the same way twice.
Yeah. I was like, wait, is this a trick? Are these a little different than the ones?
No, it wasn't a trick. That was trying to get a fair coverage of the questions that had been covered in the reading quizzes to try to make sure that we covered everything. But I guess I could have substituted. I didn't want to have duplicate questions. Okay, other concerns? Let's get on with our lecture today. And so we'll be talking about human population rates of growth. I'll talk about the prophecy of Malthus and the quality of life, population growth and exponential growth. So this will be mostly lecture during this period. And then toward the end, in the last 15 minutes or so, we'll break up into the teams, and you can have a look at the reading assignment that I put out for your in-class teamwork this week. So, we talk about human demographic principles, the demographic transition. These are important concepts as we try to understand human population growth, in particular, how human population, the growth of human populations, because of the technological and social achievements that human species have attained, human population growth is different and from other population growths, but at the same time, it obeys a lot of the same laws. It's just that we have, because of our consciousness and the way that we approach problems, we understand limiting factors in different ways. And of course, the human species is, particularly in its modern technological example, is very, very well equipped for overcoming limiting factors that would affect other populations. And we're seeing this played out in a particularly graphic way in present as the global population deals with this COVID-19 pandemic, which is having, despite its relatively small impact in absolute numbers in terms of the number of people who are dying compared to the numbers of people who exist, the impact on society is incredibly profound and threatening to be rather long lasting. And so some of the questions that you'll be considering in your breakout groups, deal with this aspect. But mostly we wanted to start out by, making sure that we understand a lot of the principles of, was everybody seeing the screen that I'm sharing? No, I guess not. Let me share that screen. There we go. So a lot of the principles that we need to master concern, the basic arithmetic of population growth and the way that different factors can determine how populations grow. In particular, we think about poverty and education as determining factors in how many children society, the birth rate that characterizes society. So first, for the prophecy of Malthus, I wonder how many people have heard of Malthus and the prophecy of Malthus. It comes up an awful lot. And this was Malthus was an Episcopal priest in England. And so he was very concerned with morality, and a lot of his, the way that he phrased his ideas had to, made sort of moral judgments about human character and, particularly sexuality and reproduction, which, he, viewed with a very sort of judgmental way. And so, but here's the prophecy, and I'll read it out, and then we'll talk about what it means. Famine seems to be the last. Hello?
Professor, I don't know if you're meaning to share like a specific screen, but we're just seeing an overview of all of the PowerPoint.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry, wrong sharing. Share screen. There we go. How's that? Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so you should be just seeing the display which says the prophecy of Malthus. I thought I had clicked the right one there, but I guess not. So the prophecy, as Malthus wrote it out in, I think, 1790, no, I think it was 1840 he wrote this. Famine seems to be the last most dreadful resource of nature. The power of population is so superior to the power on earth to produce the subsistence for man that premature death must in some shape or other visit the human race. The vices of mankind are active and are able ministers of depopulation. They are the precursors in the great army of destruction and often finish the dreadful work themselves. But should they fail in this war of extermination, sickly seasons, epidemics, pestilence, and plague advance in terrific array and sweep off their thousands and tens of thousands. Should success still be incomplete, gigantic, inevitable famine stalks in the rear and with one mighty blow levels the population with the food of the world. Well, dreadful language and imagery there, but what's he really saying? So that the population, the power of population, this is the idea that he expresses here, the power of population, by which he means the power of the human species, or of any species indeed, to reproduce itself, to grow in size. And he's referring here, although he may not specifically state it, to this sort of exponential feedback relationship that we talked about previously in population growth, where the larger a population is, the more people there are, the more members of the population there are to reproduce, and the faster it tends to reproduce. And so this is the power of population exponential growth. And he says that this is superior to the power on earth to produce sustenance for man. In other words, that the rate of population growth can outstrip the resources which are needed to sustain the population. Okay, so what stops this happening? What are the limiting factors that affect human beings? And the vices of man are active and able ministers of depopulation. Well, here by the vices of mankind, I think he's referring to armed conflict and war, and they are precursors in the great army of destruction. So he's sort of invoking here, a world in which population outstrips itself, and poverty, epidemics, pestilence, and plague, he's sort of lumping them all together, advance in terrific array and sweep off their thousands and 10,000s. So if the population grows too large, then it becomes susceptible to pestilence, to plague, and sickness. And this is of course something that Malthus will have observed in his time period, that there were indeed plagues and epidemics, pandemics, that killed, even in that late date, thousands or tens of thousands of people. And of course, Europeans had historical memory of bubonic plague and other plagues that had ravaged European populations, reducing them by as much as a quarter on some periods. And then ultimately, if pandemics don't work, there's famine, so that the population can grow so large that it will be unable to produce enough food to eat. So this is a pretty pessimistic view of the world. Now, it's interesting to note that the prophecy of Malthus and this particular sort of gloomy view of the world was also influential on another great thinker, probably better known than Malthus, namely Darwin. And so Darwin looked at this idea of limiting factors on populations and competition among individual species, and took this same sort of absolutist view to heart when he began thinking about how there was sort of endless competition among species, and that the winners of those competitions, would produce the most viable species, and those species would persist. So this idea was implicit or explicit even in Darwin's thinking, that led to the development of the theory of evolution. Social Darwinism is a sort of another step in all this, which says, oh, okay, well, people are competing for limited resources, and the theory of evolution says that the most successful ones will succeed, and therefore there's kind of a moral umbrella over excessive competition that allows certain groups to be more successful, more prosperous, better fed than others, and that has some sort of an implicit moral judgment in that. So these ideas of population and how they affect are themes and threads that run through both social thought and scientific thought. Okay, well, if we think about total fertility rate, the things that he's talking about, how can we break this down and try to understand it better in terms of the actual way in which human populations reproduce? So when we talk about, the expected rate of population, the term is total fertility rate. And total fertility rate is the average number of children expected to be born to a woman during her lifetime. Demographers, people who study, scientists who study populations, typically reduce the population to only those that are females, which makes the arithmetic more straightforward. And so the average number of children per woman is a more a compact way of expressing the population of a fertility rate of a population, which of course comprises both men and women, males and females. And how do social practices and different views affect fertility? For example, is polygamy in Arab countries, among the early Mormons, and among various other groups. So that's a social practice which clearly has an impact on fertility. Another example was the preference for males or male children in China. And China has dropped its one-child policy, but for a long time, it was the policy of the Chinese government only to allow a single child to be born to a family. And so the preference for male children resulted in missing females, missing girls who were either aborted or otherwise neglected, such that there is a real gap in the present day population characteristics of China, where there are fewer than expected numbers of females. And so, and that clearly would have an impact on fertility rates in the community. So some additional basic concepts. So rates of growth very often are inversely proportionate or related to the nation's per capita income. And that, which is to say that as the per capita income, the general wealth of society increases, the birth rate tends to decrease. And so there's a feedback loop here, so that if there are more children than it's economically able to support, it reduces a result of increasing poverty. And that feedback loop can run in reverse as well. So we've already talked about this population impact, the number of people and the environmental impact per person. That's something that was brought up in chapter 1 of Hasnazal. There's the total environmental impact of a family, which is the total number of people times the impact per person, and raising either variable, the number of people or the impact per people, in other words, the consumption or patterns of consumption, increases the total impact of that population. So impact of a population, by impact we mean the way in which the population affects the long-term sustainability of the environment, depends on consumption rate and population density. Dense populations tend to have large local impacts. And we can apply that to the density of populations in urban settings. And we could also examine that among the populations of countries in Europe, which tend to have much greater densities, numbers of people per square kilometer than we have in the United States. Consumptive populations have large global reach and utilize vastly more resources. So, the United States has, a disproportionate consumption rate for human populations. Well, there have been different eras in human populations, and so what we talk about is human population rate now, fertility rate now, is very much a product of our modern medical and technological society. So we have the ability to cure diseases, which lowers mortality rates. We also have the ability to plan families through birth control and other methods. So our current population and the way our population is responding to various pressures is very much a product of the kind of society and the kind of technological and medical resources that we have. But let's, look back at, how population grew during different periods of time, and we can get a sense of that. So the early humans, the sort of post-glacial human beings, which were, a few tens of millions of people spread across the globe, had a very small, very low growth rate. So like, a fraction of 1%, 1/10,000th of 1% per year. So a very, very slow rate of growing. Well, this is because living as hunter-gatherers, the ability to expand your population is limited by disease, by childhood mortality caused by a wide range of factors. So it's very difficult for people who are, for population groups that are supporting themselves by hunting and gathering to grow larger. Now this was changed as early, as human beings discovered and began to expand the practice of agriculture. So agriculture is a way to produce a great deal more food for a population than simply having to go out and hunt for it. So the, with the earliest invention of agriculture, the population starts increasing. Something like 0.03%. During the early days of agriculture. Okay, well, this sort of chugs along and population continues to grow slowly over time. Human societies are formed, and population growth is relatively rapid in some periods. But ultimately, the population of the world is growing relatively slowly until, and then with checks on population growth caused by massive pandemics and famines and so forth, which are invoked by Malthus as he tries to understand this. Well, a lot of this starts to change with the mastery of technology and improvements of health care and food supply. And so there's a sharply, with the Industrial Revolution, there's a sharp increase in the growth rate to approximately 1/10 of 1%. So, with the Industrial Revolution becomes better methods of producing goods and services, more efficient agriculture, agriculture driven by mechanization, the ability to alter regions to make them more profitable for agriculture by irrigation or clearing land for raising cattle and so forth. So that Industrial Revolution, marks a transition in the human history of human population growth. Well, that brings us to today, the modern era, the 21st century, in which we're seeing a slowing rate of population growth for Europe and the United States, much more rapid in Asia, particularly South Asia, Africa, and South America. So now the global population rate is approximately 1.4 to 2% of the global total per year. And that rate, means that, with such a large baseline, the numbers of human beings are increasing, pretty significantly. Well, when we talk about populations, there's certain terms of dynamic, which allow us to understand the dynamics of population, the way in which different factors will affect how populations grow over time. And some of these parameters in population dynamics include the crude birth rate, which is the number of births per 1,000 individuals in a population. And then the crude growth rate is the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate. In other words, the crude birth rate is number of births per 1,000 individuals, and the crude death rate is the number of deaths per individual. So if you subtract deaths from births, you get growth rate. Maximum lifetime is the maximum possible age for an individual in a species. whereas life expectancy is the average number of remaining years for an individual at growing age. And we can see by looking at population structures, as we will shortly, that the lifespans of individuals differ very widely depending on what society they're from. And these parameters and variables can be expressed in various equations of population growth. So, if we're looking at a population size, so population size at time 1 is population size at time 2 is equal to the population size at time 1 plus the births minus the deaths plus the immigration minus emigration. So I here stands for immigration, in people entering into a country, and emigration stands for the number of people leaving a country. Now, immigration and emigration are particularly important factors when we consider how populations are changing in the present era, because facts like war, foods, famines, agricultural failure, and climate change are causing large numbers of people to immigrate or emigrate, and this produces a lot of social stress, as we know. Population growth, expressed as G, is the births minus deaths divided by the number of people. So we normalize the growth rate to the numbers of people that are present. And exponential rate and doubling time, so the population can be expressed in this exponential equation here. So the population at time t will be equal, according to this understood equation, will be equal to the population at some baseline time times 0 times e raised to a power of the growth rate over time. So G is placed in this equation here, multiplied by T, will give you the expected population at time T. And the doubling time is the time it takes in which for a population to double in size is approximated by 70 divided by the growth rate percentage. So if the growth rate, the present world growth rate is 1.75%, then the doubling time is 70 divided by 1.75, in other words, about 40 years. So this formula, which you can use for anything, not just the doubling time of populations, but you can use it for the expected rate of return for an investment at a certain percentage rate. This equation and this approximation here, this doesn't give you a precise answer, it gives you an approximate answer, but this formula tells us that at a present rate of growth, we could expect to double our population in 40 years. And adjust this for whatever we think it is. But if we consider that the world population now is approaching very rapidly 8 billion human beings, well, then a doubling in 40 years would produce 16 billion people. And considering the stresses that human populations place on the global ecosystem and on social stability, etc., a population of 16 billion human beings seems to be beyond what we would expect to be sustainable or practical. Well, let's look at how these factors have changed globally over time. So population growth depends a lot more on the total fertility rate than life expectancy. What does that mean? Well, it makes sense because people are not fertile for their entire lives. So people tend to have children relatively early in life, more or less in the first third of life, the first half of life. Whereas, they continue to survive and grow for a lot longer than that. But, survival to this childbearing age, in other words, being able to make it out of infancy and childhood and into adulthood, young adulthood, is a crucial factor for whether or not a population is going to be growing. And the total fertility rate in future populations is going to have a major impact on population growth. Okay. Now here I want to stop and ask a few questions just to sort of see where the class is at. And this is intended to be fun. I'm going to put up a poll here about the attitudes of our class towards forming stable relationships, of call them whatever you like and however they would exist, that might or might not produce children. So let me stop sharing my screen at this point, and I'll put up a poll, hopefully. Let's see. And there are 3 questions in this poll, so go ahead and answer all 3. You all seeing this poll? Hello? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, go ahead and answer. Okay. Everybody get a chance to answer these questions? I'll leave
Yes,
it up
sir.
for a few minutes more, and then I'll end the polling and we'll look at the results. Everybody had a chance to answer? Okay. So, what is the best age for forming a lasting romantic partnership, like marriage, a partnership within which children might be brought? So most people say 26. Very few people expect to get married in their 30s. So 26 is the ideal age for this class to have form a marriage-like partnership, and that's would put people mostly in the peak of their childbearing years. So a preference for a lasting romantic partnership at roughly this age would allow people to have physical and social capabilities of producing children or having children. So how many children would you like to have? Well, here's interesting. 2 seems to be the ideal number. With a sizable number of people who don't want children at all, certainly a valid choice. Interestingly, in the United States, in order to keep the population stable, you have to have a population of about, or a birth rate of about 2.2 or 2.3 children per woman. And that's because of infant mortality and so forth. So if you look at the average here, we're probably right at around 2.2 or 2.3, the average of expected number here. Well, 0, I don't know. I guess we could figure that out. It looks like, in terms of preference here, the folks in this class would be producing enough children to maintain the population at a stable rate. Now, here's an interesting question. What factors would limit your desire for children? None. I don't want kids, so a significant fraction don't want to have kids, and some people are determined to have children. And then economic well-being. Look at how how important this is in terms of, whether or not children could be born. So, the way in which people's economic well-being affects their ability to have or desire to have children is very much typical of a developing country. I think we might get a different answer if we were asking this question in Kenya or Thailand or somewhere else where larger families and lower economic well-being were more characteristics. It's also, I'm talking to my own, I have 2 children, and neither of them are either married or seem inclined to give me a grandchild. And when I ask them what's up, they're very much, it's not so much economic well-being because both of them are gainfully employed, but really it's a concern for the future, a moral choice against bringing more children into a world that's already overpopulated possibly, and a concern for the well-being of these children. So that's what I hear from my own kids, and I wonder, if that's a factor, how big a factor that is in your all choices. So let's have a little discussion about that. I can, we've got a few more slides to show, but I'm interested in the reactions to folks here. So if you have a reaction to these polling results, or just want to add something to this, or object to the fact that we're asking these questions at all, go ahead and raise your hand and ask your question or make your comment.
When you had your kids, did you think about having or like bringing kids in and think about like whether or not they'd have good lives like in an already overpopulated world?
I guess we probably did, but no, it wasn't a major consideration. No, there was much more, when we were having our kids, it was much more sort of personal choice. And then the question of having whether or not to have a second child after the first child was born, that was a long discussion, but it didn't, I don't think for us personally, that it had any, that we were deeply considering. Well, I don't know, it's hard to say. But the decision to have a second child was more difficult and caused more discussion than the decision to have a first child. I'll say that.
Professor McDonald, there are some people in the chat that are wondering what the average age for the students in this class is. Is there any way that you can make a poll really fast to see how old we all are?
Sure. Let's see. All right, I'll do that. Stop sharing results, polls. Edit.
I'll bet I'm the oldest.
All right, I'm going to start at, I'm going to assume that everybody's 18, 20, 22, 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, 34, 35 plus. Okay, there you go.
So do you want us to round up or round down? Because you only put even numbers in there, so.
I guess round down.
Do whatever one you're closer to.
Hmm? Whatever one you're closer to. There you go. All right, so average age of around 20. which is what we would expect for a college population and a college group. Few people who are in their 30s, and maybe one person who's over 35. I wonder who that might be.
It's me. I'll go ahead and say I'm 48.
Do you have kids?
Do not have kids. I was married for 25 years, had a little bit of a rough divorce, and we decided always to not have children because we liked to do a lot of traveling, and we just never thought it was right to bring kids into the world if we didn't give them 100% of our time. That was sort of our feeling back then. But
Okay.
this was back in the early 90s. So I graduated college in 94, so I'm kind of returning a long time later.
Well, welcome back. It's good to have the perspective of more than one over 30 person.
I think someone else is over 35 as well. I think I saw somebody in a chat saying they were 47.
Okay, well, my being here raises the average age of the class considerably. So I'm quite a bit older than that. Okay, well, so that's interesting because people looking ahead to a ideal age of 26 for forming a partnership, that's something that you're on average as a class looking forward to and anticipating. And it's interesting, to me that, as an aggregate, everybody has their own choice and there's no sort of, this is just for fun really, or for, but it's interesting that people are looking ahead at age 20 to what you might expect in the coming years. And, so this is very much a formative time in your lives, as I'm sure you recognize. And part of that formation has to do with, the expectation of romantic or, partnerships and possibly children. So individual choices and anticipation about economic well-being, social progress and so forth very much affect how we think about child rearing and so forth. All right, well, let me go back to the lecture slides and we'll carry on with our lecture there, having learned a little bit about ourselves collectively here. Okay, so population, so the total fertility rate of future populations will have a major impact on population growth. So your choices, which you're going to make, most of you have not yet had children, will have a very much of an impact on how America changes with respect to new people coming in. And the growth of society economically and so forth, is a very important factor in determining, how economic outcomes can play out. And there is a sort of an expectation that the population, that the society continues to grow at some rate or another. And that growth is necessary for maintaining all sorts of things, for real estate, for selling durable goods, refrigerators, cars, houses, and so forth. There is an expectation built into society that will continue to have population growth. And the fact that many countries in Europe are experiencing very slow or low population growth, is a factor that plays into whether or not their financial success. Okay, so what is they were taking an arbitrary mid-year of 2015 here, but from 2020 to 2050, when this is a sort of pre-pandemic reckoning, because the pandemic has impacted global population growth and rates of poverty in significant ways. And so, these curves could change as a result of these predicted curves could change as a result of, changes to society that are being brought on by this pandemic. So from 2020 to 2050, it's expected that most of the population growth will be concentrated in just a few countries. And these countries are India, Nigeria, the Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, Pakistan, Ethiopia, and Tanzania. The United States of America, Uganda, and Indonesia. So the United States of America is, expected to experience continued population growth. Now, the population growth of the United States of America, let's see if we can click on this and see if we get somewhere. I guess I'm not going to be able to bring up that screen. But the United States of America expects to have, or is expected to experience, continued population growth. Now, it's interesting that the population growth in the United States is driven not so much by intrinsic growth, by the birth of children in the United States, as it is by immigration. So, in 2015, when these graphs were formulated, it was anticipated that we would continue to have immigration, and that our immigration rate, our rate of immigration, would keep our population rate of population growth constant. Which is different from some of the countries of Europe, where population growth is relatively flat or even negative. But of course, current social changes and political changes have really put a cap on the number of immigrants that are arriving, and that is having an impact on the way that the population changes, and that lack of growth has an impact on a variety of economic questions in the United States. A lot of unemployment, or lack of available employees, is driven by the fact that there aren't enough people, and particularly if you look regionally. So the United States is sort of a special case in this because of our high, or traditionally high, immigration rates. So I use the term demography, and demography is, so these are some terms there: age structure, and the demographic transition. I already talked about population environment, death rate environment, population growth, and the standard of living. But let me look at this question of age structure and demographic transition, because these are important concepts in here. So we're going to look now at demographic changes in different regions. So here's a graph that I downloaded just a few minutes ago, and this relates childhood mortality rate. Which childhood mortality is the death of children before they reach reproductive age. So the number of children that that die, and the expectation of a child to die. And then this is the numbers of children per woman. And so you can see very quickly here that in places where childhood mortality is high, there tends to be more children born per woman. And so the total fertility rate tends to be higher. And you can also see that some of the countries that were named in the previous slide as being, drivers in the total population expected rate of population growth. Oops, going the wrong direction. So Nigeria, Democratic Republic of China, Pakistan, Ethiopia, Tanzania. If you look here, you can find a lot of these countries exactly where we would expect, with high mortality rate, high fertility rates, and high childhood mortality rates. And so we can, regionalize these trends over time and look at percentages of the world population and how they're responding. So, the different periods. We've seen population growth at different, so historically, the growth of populations has differed among different regions. So the United States and Canada experienced the highest rates of population growth around 1900. That was also true for Europe. And then if you fast forward into more recent times, the 2000s and the 2100s, population growth has fallen, both in the United States and in Europe. The trend is not the same for Latin America and Africa. So in Latin America and Africa, the rates of population growth have increased over time. So, this implies that there's some sort of change which is taking place in these different countries that are affecting them at different times. And so keep this in mind. We'll get to that in a minute when we talk about this question of demographic transition, which is an important concept. All right, but let's talk first about population structure. And these are the famous population pyramids. And these are, pyramids. This is an old slide. I should probably get a newer one. This is an old slide that's showing the year of birth and the numbers of individuals in that year of birth. So each one of these bars is like a bar chart, and typically the females in the population are on one side. The females are on the right side, and the males are on the left side. So if we look at a country like Kenya, which is experiencing rapid population growth, you get this sort of broad-based, pyramid with a narrow, spire at the top. So what is this telling us? This is telling us, first of all, that the population is expanding rapidly, that there are large numbers of people under 30, within their peak childbearing years, and also telling us that the expected life, or the life expectancy, is relatively low for this population, so that the numbers of individuals in the higher demographic age groups falls off sharply as we go up. If we look at a country, compare that to a country like the United States, we see a couple of things here in this reveal. First of all, we see that the base of the pyramid really really can't call it a pyramid. The base is slightly wider at the bottom than it is, going up, but that overall, that there's a relatively slow rate of growth. Of course, we have to consider the population as a whole. And, if we look at the year of birth, and we see that there's this sort of this bulge here between 1945 and 1965. Well, this is also kind of sometimes referred to as the pig and the python. But what does anybody have any idea? What we're looking at when we look at this bulge in population, in the population age structure of the United States? What would that be attributable to?
The baby boom.
The baby boom, exactly. So, this is what that baby boom shows us is that some, in a particular period of time, of course, everybody knows that baby boom occurred after World War II, and, there was a lot of prosperity in the United States and sort of a release from the stresses of being at war, and the economy in the United States was expanding very rapidly. Lots of people had babies. And so, I myself am in this portion of the baby boom. So I'm very much a baby boomer, or a boomer. I guess a boomer is what you call us now. And so, but that increase in the growth rate, although it was temporary, didn't last forever, that has a lasting impact on the way that the population is structured, and will have a lasting and predictable impact on, demands for services, environmental impact, and so forth throughout the lifespan of those individuals. So as the baby boomers, age out of the workforce, begin needing services like, medical care and nursing homes and so forth, the existence of this of this bulge in the population structure is going to have, an impact on, what people are able to provide. And so, your Social Security, the money that you're paying into Social Security will pay for my stipend when I retire, and that's the way that we've structured our society. And if there is a decline or a sharp decline in birth rates, a lot of the assumptions that we make about how we're going to pay for things and what kind of services are needed could change, and that's something that comes up a lot. Let's take the third increase, which is the example of Italy. So Italy, also experienced a bit of a baby boom. It came somewhat later than ours, but then that declined sharply. And currently, the zero rate of growth in Italy, although they make up for some of that by immigration. So they're very low birth rate, despite the fact that this is a Catholic country, so there's not a sort of religious discouragement for childbirthing, but that doesn't seem to have an effect in terms of if we look at the actual numbers here. So these population structures, and these population pyramids, although some of them are obviously not pyramids, they look more like, I don't know, Jenga tower or something else. They tell us a lot about the current situation in the country and what might be expected over time. And so I would expect, that you could look at one of these, this kind of a graph here and make the same kind of interpretations about, the countries that I've been making just now. So, that brings us to this question of replacement level fertility and something else called population momentum. So the population, the TFR, required for a population to remain constant is about 2.1, 2.15 children per female, and that extra percentage there accounts for mortality rate. Well, this is a global average. Stability in countries with high childhood mortality would have to be higher than this. Now, here's an important fact. Once people are born, they are going to live their lives and make such decisions as they will about whether or not to have children. So once people have entered the population, there's a sort of, they create a kind of a population growth momentum, which is really sort of unstoppable. Demographics are really a powerful factor and underappreciated factor in societal structure. So even if birth rates are declining, the population momentum will cause the population to continue to grow even after, when the total fertility rate is achieved. So if we think about this, growth in Kenya, all of these people, aged 0 to say 20, they are still going to have to, are going to experience, continued life and make reproductive choices as they get older. So this, the youngest portion of the population is what really creates the momentum for that. Well, what does this mean over time? Well, we've looked at this logistic curve. We've looked at it in a number of ways, and it's one of the sort of, defining factors or important concepts in understanding how populations work. So the logistic curve predicts, rapid growth in this period of time when the population has really established itself and is making best use of its resources, and that over time, various limiting factors will come into play and cause the world population to stabilize. Well, that's a nice theory, but in fact, we have not yet reached that plateau in global population growth. How we get there is determined by something called demographic transitions. And we could use these kind of numbers to sort of predict what the eventual size of the carrying capacity of the country is. All right, well, let me specifically deal with this concept of demographic transition, because this is something that people have to think about carefully to understand. And so the first, so demographic transitions describe changes in the birth rate and population structure of societies. And the theory of demographic transitions predicts that these, in a population growing rapidly, that these transitions will follow a predicted pattern. So the first pattern, interestingly, is that, and this occurs in the developing countries, is that improved sanitation or higher standards of living tend to reduce the death rate, the mortality rate. And in particular, the mortality rate, just because of people's propensity to take care of children, the childhood mortality rate is the first thing to come down. So as the death rate falls, but the birth rate does not, we would expect the first demographic transition to actually produce an increase in population size, okay? Then over time, if the population stabilizes itself and there's sufficient resources and other factors of stability within a country or region, the birth rate may decline again. This demographic transition would initially produce an increase in population size, and then eventually the two curves would merge and you have a stable stage 3. So this is the underdeveloped stage, the transitional and stable phase 3. And there's a second decline in chronic in transition due to a decline in chronic health diseases. And so, as society become more advanced and more able to provide widespread medical care, there's a decrease in mortality due to diseases, infectious diseases, and so forth. And now it's interesting to note that in both of these cases, the birth rate will change. And so they both, the birth rate and the death rate sort of depart during these transitional stages, and then you end up with a secondary stable stage. Okay? So the first demographic transition is caused by a decline in death rates due to improved sanitation. Birth rate is a lagging indicator on this. And the second transition, and it's not really named in here, is a decline in birth rate due to more widespread choice. Women making different decisions about childbearing related to better prosperity and more broad social choice. So this second transition is a complicated one in that it relates both to individual choices that people make and also in terms of access to medical technology. So what are some differences in the causes of death in different countries? We can expect that to be reflected here. So differences in causes of death, there are different factors here. So if we look at the United States, in 1900, we can see that the kinds of things that are causing mortality, respiratory diseases, tuberculosis, gastrointestinal diseases, and so forth. And so the United States in 1900, was closely similar in terms of the causes of death to Ecuador in the late 20th century. Some different changes in here, and these may be due to different factors and so forth. And the United States, when it transitions, the causes of death, really shift. So heart disease cancer. You can see that infectious diseases, tuberculosis, respiratory diseases really decline as major factors of mortality in more advanced societies. And so if we think back to how the different demographic transitions work, we can see that access to better medical care and more widespread use of things like antibiotics and so forth, really shift this around, because heart disease and cancer, these are causes of mortality which are not related to, or not easily or as easily controlled by widespread use of sanitation and antibiotics. Okay, so this gets us to this question of the demographic transition applied to different countries. So we can see here over time, the birth rate has declined in developed countries. So the death rate falls first, and then the birth rate declines. And then if we look at developing countries, we see a similar sort of pattern, just with shifted forward in time. So developing countries are undergoing some of the same sorts of changes that historically occurred in the Western developed countries. Well, what are the, what is the ultimate limits here, and what can we expect, and how does excess population, a large population of human beings on the planet, how does that affect the prospects? So, the carrying capacity of the Earth, improving the living standards in poor countries may negate the benefits of controlling population growth. So, if we improve standards of living, we may see initially a surge in population growth. And, the maximum number of people that can live on the planet, implies certain kinds of value judgments about the quality of life and the desire of, freedom of choice and democracy and so forth. And we also ultimately have to think about how the way that different populations in different parts of the globe compete for resources. And to this, we might add the question of how competition for resources might change if we have sort of disastrous effects of climate change, which within the limits of production that the International Panel on Climate Change has predicted, we could see large areas of the globe become less habitable for human populations, and we could have conditions in which people would be displaced on a large scale from portions of the world, and that would, introduce a level of instability and competition that's really kind of unlike anything that we've seen previous. So limiting factors are those which limit population growth, and they may be short-term limiting factors, or intermediate term, or long-term. And the food supply is the resource which is most susceptible to constraint by short-term limiting factors. So changing the food supply will have a drastic effect, particularly in countries that are more marginal in terms of their economic well-being. They're going to have a short-term effect on population growth. But pollution, energy sources, desertification, disruption of renewable and non-renewable sources are intermediate limiting factors. And to this, we would include climate change. Ultimately, if climate change and other of these factors produce long-term or persistent changes to the global ecosystem, we could see, the concept of limiting factors really expanding. If we look at the population, sort of objectively, in terms of, like we were Martians or something evaluating, the future of humanity, we might conclude that, the per capita availability of certain kinds of resources would suggest that we have a human population that's at or near its current long-term carrying capacity. Hard to say, but very much the fact. All right, so let's, I'll stop my lecture at this point. I have a few more things that I'll say when we get together again on Thursdays, but I'll go ahead and open up the breakout rooms and just go ahead and have a look at the briefly at the assignment for this week, and make some decisions about who's going to read the different factors and how you'll approach the in-class assignment. So opening the breakout rooms. Yes, Gwen, did you have a question? Oh, I have to. Let's see. So Caroline, you go to
I'm in the Planeteers.
Planeteers.
So am I, Dalia.
Anybody else want to go to the Planeteers? How about Carrie? I'll put you in the Planeteers. Darren, you go to the Aquatic Junkies. Emily, you're in
The Wayfinders.
Wayfinders. And Kate, you're in
Team title.
Team Title. Whitney, Big Lean Machine.
Yes.
Professor, I'm in Turtle Protection Squad.
Oh, you managed not to get in there, Claudia?
No.
Okay, I'm not seeing you on my board here. Oh, let's see. You should be able to join. Are you not seeing your?
No, I don't see it. Maybe if I leave the Zoom call and then return.
Yeah, you might have to do that, Claudia. Sometimes that happens where you can't access the breakout rooms.
Okay, I'll do that. It's still not working.
Huh. All right, so you want to go to Turtle Protection Squad? Sorry, is that right?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, I guess we're back together. So you had a chance to look at those documents to read, and you can also do additional research on that. I wonder if anybody had any thoughts or comments on the general premise there of how COVID-19. So what we're trying to do with this assignment is to specifically break out how this current situation, where we've thought about disease as being and pandemics as being a sort of controller on human population growth and societal well-being. But in the United States, at least, that was always kind of an abstract concept. We think about diseases, pandemics, epidemics as being something that happened in the Middle Ages, not something that would affect us now, or the Spanish influenza 100 years ago. It didn't really have an immediacy, but now it does. And I think one of the things that we're discovering is that how disruptive it is. Even though the actual mortality rate is quite low, not that many people are dying or even becoming sick from COVID compared to the total size of the population, but it's having this extreme effect. So when you get back together, we'll spend most of the next Thursday in your groups, talking over these things, and then we'll get back together and I'll choose each team to go through and make a presentation on each of the questions. And I expect these presentations to be, a little bit better organized. I'd like you to sort of bring more to the table, than has been the case. I think generally these team presentations kind of need to step up your game a little bit, because we're getting to the point where teams are going to be needing to make presentations or get ready for a class presentation. And so I'd like you to really, work a little bit harder at thinking about what you're going to say and how you're going to say it in respect to these prompts. All right, well, we're at the end of our class period. If anybody has any questions or would like to hang around and, discuss the things that we brought up, now it's a pretty much open time. You can leave, of course, if you need to go somewhere else. Does anybody have any comments on what we've been looking at and thinking about just now today, or questions?
I was wondering when we'll be able to see what we got wrong on the midterm.
You mean the multiple choice?
Yeah, like when the answers will be available.
Okay, I got some people who are still haven't taken it yet, so it'll be the end of this week. And I'll
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I glanced at the poverty article, like the poverty rate article.
Yeah.
And I understand how it's going down and stuff, but what are some of the actual what are reasons why people are being put into poverty other than just not being able to work and stuff? Is it just that really?
Well, I think that's the case in the United States. People, I think what it's saying is that people's savings rate and the resources that they have, tend to be pretty limited, so that sort of living paycheck to paycheck kind of thing. And there are places in the world where like they say in Haiti, travail pour manger, which means work to eat. In other words, if you don't work, you don't eat on a particular day. And so in places where poverty is particularly acute, not having work or not being able to freely circulate, very quickly tumbles people into really abject problems. That's been the case in India, where they've had COVID, and the people who are pretty marginal in society, or really kind of subsistence sort of existence. As soon as the regular business of the economy is disrupted, they got nothing, no place to go. And so poverty in India is really on the rise as a result of both the pandemic and the way the pandemic has been managed.
Thank you.
Other questions or thoughts or reactions? Okay. All right, well, I guess I'll end the class now, and look forward to seeing you all when we get back together on Thursday.